The moment has come when history bends toward a new chapter, and for Africa, that chapter may be defined by a single call that is echoed across the continent with extraordinary force. The call for a unified African currency, a united African economic front, and the dawn of Africa's final liberation. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso speaks of Afro money in one Africa, it is not merely rhetoric designed to excite crowds or inspire patriotic fervor. It is the articulation of a vision that confronts centuries of exploitation, decades of dependency, and the structural inequalities built into the very foundations of global finance. It is an audacious challenge to a world order that has for too long treated Africa as a pawn rather than a player, a source of raw materials rather than a hub of industrial and human potential, and a continent fragmented by artificial borders rather than united by its shared destiny. To grasp the magnitude of this moment, one must look back at Africa's long entanglement with colonialism and post-colonial dependency. The continent's wealth has always been its curse, from the gold and ivory of the pre-colonial period to the cocoa, cotton, uranium, and oil that fuel today's economies abroad. For centuries, Africa's resources flowed outward while poverty, division, and instability took root inward. Colonial powers not only exploited land and labor, but also deliberately crafted economic systems that ensure dependency. Even after independence, the structures of global finance and trade continued to trap Africa in cycles of debt and underdevelopment. The imposition of foreign currencies, such as the CFA Franc, tied to European treasuries and institutions, kept entire regions of Africa financially tethered to former colonial masters. The promise of political freedom was undermined by the reality of economic servitude. It is in this historical and deeply symbolic context that Traoré's call gains its true weight. The notion of Afro money is not just about printing new banknotes or designing a shared currency. It is about severing the last chains of economic domination. It is about taking control of monetary policy, interest rates, reserves, and exchange mechanisms that today are still heavily influenced, if not directly controlled, from outside the continent. For decades, African leaders have spoken of unity, but few have dared to stake their legitimacy on tangible steps toward economic sovereignty. Traoré, however, has thrust this conversation back into the spotlight with vigor, daring Africans to believe that the time is now, not some distant future. The call for one Africa is equally revolutionary. The modern boundaries of the continent are a colonial invention, drawn hastily by imperial powers in Berlin in 1884, with little regard for the cultures, histories, or aspirations of the people who live there. These lines on maps fractured societies, fueled conflicts, and created states often too small to exert real economic leverage on the global stage. Today, the reality is that individual African nations often lack the bargaining power to stand up to superpowers, multinational corporations, or financial institutions. Yet, together, Africa represents the largest reservoir of untapped potential in the world. A population of 1.4 billion, a median age under 20, trillions of dollars in natural wealth, and a rapidly growing technological and entrepreneurial class. The idea of one Africa, then, is not an abstract dream. It is a pragmatic recognition that only unity can transform this potential into real power. But as with every bold idea, skepticism arises. The notion of a single African currency, like the euro in Europe, faces immense technical, political, and logistical challenges. Nations differ in economic strength, inflation rates, and governance structures. Corruption, instability, and external pressure could all derail the project. Yet one must recall that every grand transformation in history seemed impossible until it happened. The European Union itself emerged from a continent once torn apart by wars more brutal than anything Africa has endured in modern times. If Europe could forge economic unity after centuries of bloodshed, why should Africa not believe in its own capacity to do the same? Traoré's rhetoric is not just economic. It is deeply political and symbolic. His vision for Afro money is tied directly to the idea of liberation. Liberation here is not simply the absence of foreign domination, but the presence of dignity, control, and self-determination. When African nations borrow in foreign currencies, they are perpetually vulnerable to fluctuations in international markets and the dictates of institutions like the IMF and World Bank. When reserves are held in European capitals instead of African ones, sovereignty is hollow. Traoré frames Afro money as the ultimate antidote to this cycle of dependency, the cornerstone of what he describes as Africa's final liberation. The response to this call has been mixed but charged with energy. For young Africans, who make up the majority of the population, Traoré's words strike a powerful chord. They represent a rejection of the status quo, a chance to dream beyond the limits set by failed leadership and foreign interference. For older generations, his call revives the Pan-African spirit that animated leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Julius Nyerere, who all dreamed of a united Africa. Yet among some elites and entrenched political classes, there is caution, if not outright resistance. A unified Africa threatens vested interests, those who benefit from bilateral deals, those whose power depends on division, and those whose wealth is tied to foreign patronage. Globally, Traoré's call is being watched with equal parts curiosity and concern. For the Western world, Afro money represents a direct challenge to the financial architecture that has long guaranteed Western influence over Africa. For emerging powers like China, India, and Russia, a unified Africa presents both opportunity and risk. On the one hand, a continent that can negotiate collectively could become a formidable partner, offering markets, resources, and political alignment. On the other, it could also mean tougher negotiations, fewer concessions, and less vulnerability to manipulation. In either case, the global balance of power would shift. One must also consider the symbolic timing of this message. At a moment when global institutions are losing credibility, when even the dollar faces challenges from emerging blocs like BRICS, Africa's demand for its own financial independence resonates more strongly than ever. The idea of Afro money aligns with broader trends of de-dollarization, the pursuit of alternative payment systems, and the assertion of multipolarity in world affairs. Africa is not alone in seeking alternatives to Western-dominated systems. Nations across Latin America and Asia are similarly questioning the fairness of the existing financial order. Traoré's call, therefore, situates Africa not as an isolated actor, but as part of a global chorus demanding reform. Critics argue that Africa is not ready, that its institutions are too weak, its leaders too divided, and its infrastructure too underdeveloped. But one must ask, when will Africa ever be ready if it waits for perfection? No nation or union has ever achieved integration in ideal conditions. The act of uniting itself builds the capacity needed for success. Afro money, if pursued, would force African nations to confront corruption, harmonize regulations, improve accountability, and invest in shared systems. The very challenges cited as obstacles could become the drivers of reform. Traoré's framing of this movement as Africa's final liberation is both provocative and profound. It suggests that political independence was merely the first step, incomplete without economic sovereignty. It suggests that true dignity cannot exist while Africa's wealth is priced, traded, and controlled in foreign capitals. It suggests that Africa's young generations will no longer accept the excuses of leaders who talk of unity, but govern in division. This is not merely a call for currency. It is a call for consciousness, a demand for Africans to believe in themselves and act accordingly. The path forward will not be easy. Questions of leadership will arise. Who will govern Afro money? How will monetary policy be set? How will weaker economies be supported? What safeguard will exist against inflation, corruption, or political misuse? These are real and urgent concerns. Yet, for once, the debate itself marks progress. For too long, Africa has not even been invited to the table where global financial rules are written. To even imagine Afro money is to assert that Africa deserves a seat at that table, or better yet, the courage to build its own. As Traoré continues to champion this cause, the reactions of other African leaders will be decisive. Some may join him openly, seeing in his vision a reflection of their own frustrations. Others may resist, fearing backlash from powerful partners or the loss of their privileged positions. Yet history has always been shaped not by unanimous agreement at the start, but by the courage of a few to imagine what others deemed impossible. The African Union, often criticized as slow and symbolic, may find in this moment a chance to prove its relevance, to spearhead the groundwork for monetary and political unity that could transform the continent. The international media will continue to frame Traoré in varied lights. Some will call him radical, others reckless, still others visionary. Yet whatever the labels, the undeniable fact remains that he has reignited a conversation that refuses to be silenced. Afro Money, One Africa, Final Liberation. These are not mere slogans. They are declarations of intent, designed to unsettle the comfortable, empower the marginalized, and inspire a generation. In the end, whether Afro Money becomes reality in 5 years, 10 years, or more, the true revolution may already have begun. It lies in the shift of mindset, the refusal to accept dependency as destiny, the courage to dream of Africa as master of its own fate. For the young farmer in Burkina Faso, the student in Lagos, the entrepreneur in Nairobi, and the worker in Johannesburg, the promise of a united Africa carries the hope of fair trade, stronger economies, and a future in which Africa is respected not as a charity case, but as an equal partner in global affairs. And so, when Traoré speaks of Afro Money and One Africa, he is not just talking about currency or borders. He is speaking of liberation in its truest sense. Liberation from exploitation, from dependency, from division. Liberation that is political, economic, and psychological. Liberation that signals not just survival, but dignity, prosperity, and power. It is a message that Africa's final liberation is not a distant dream, but a choice waiting to be made. The only question is whether Africa will seize this historic moment or let it slip away.